Good afternoon, everyone, online and in person. Uh, we're finishing up our grand tour of clean energy discussions. We had a great discussion last week organized by Omri Haven about agrivoltaics. That is the integration of solar into agricultural operations. And we had a great public meeting in the Okanagan. And since there's no rest for the weary, we're on it again this week. We'll have one more meeting on December 4th, which is about carbon capture and storage. And Stefan Power, Andy Wright, and I are going to release a paper in conjunction with that meeting. As you know, it is going to require billions of dollars in government investment, supposedly to capture the emissions from oil and gas. So I really hope all of you will come out for that meeting. It'll be down at the Harbor Center as well as online. So today we have Troy Abel from Western Washington University. Troy is an award-winning author, teacher, and professor of environmental policy in the Department of Urban and Environmental Planning, an affiliate member of political science at Western Washington University. He's also an affiliate faculty member of Seattle University Center for Environmental Justice and Sustainability. Dr. Abel's expertise includes environmental justice and public policy analysis. He received WWU's 2017 Social Justice Teaching Award and was co-recipient of the 2012 Linton Keith Caldwell Prize for the Best Book on Environmental Politics and received the 1994 Joseph L. Fisher Dissertation Research Award from George Mason University. Today, Troy is going to talk to us about his work on environmental justice and particularly a framework that he's introducing to look at environmental justice for the Puget Sound Energy Company in Washington State. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Troy.
Thank you very much. I'm also here representing a team that we just put together earlier this fall with a graduate student, Matthew DeRosa, Dr. Algie O with Puget Sound Energy. Sarah Roberts is an undergraduate researcher, and Jonah White, an NTT instructor and one of my GIS gurus. Just going to make an adjustment on the and this is the beginning of the development of our framework. I suppose it's about 3 months in. But Puget Sound Energy is beginning a system-wide equity assessment because of new legal requirements in the state of Washington that I will talk about. And it's essentially a map of the regulated utility process. And the process map that they started with is a very useful way to identify areas in a regulatory utility that may be better suited to what's called a distributional equity analysis, oftentimes juxtaposed with cost-benefit analysis. But we're offering a very different approach based in policy analysis that I'll get to address. But I wonder if anybody's watching recent headlines about the Conference of Party meetings in Belém, Brazil. Besides the fire that apparently engulfed a part of the venue, do you recognize this cartoon? Maybe from Instagram. This is BAM, which is short for the Belém Action Mechanism. And this is a just transition mechanism to prevent the world's shift to a low carbon economy from overburdening workers and communities like our current energy systems have done for decades. But this also came up in my news feed. The true climate justice demands a reckoning with colonialism. And it resonated because we do try to create a space where, as analysts, we can also have a reckoning with help an energy company reckon with settler colonialism. And this is from Al Jazeera. I think you can see this. And then Canada's National Observer. Is this a very popular news source, or am I just
Yes,
pulling something out of
it's popular.
the internet? So Canada should support the Global South's call for a just transition mechanism. And I want you can see their version of the cartoon. This is from the Batman series. Actually, the television series, they would use these little flashes. But you see justice on the left, you see equity on the right. I think that's how you spell labor, right?
Yes.
I American English, so I just had to check that out. Labor rights, inclusion. I'm kidding. And expectedly, the United States and Canada oppose BAM. But turns out there's a government immediately south of your border already legally committed to a just transition. It's not the United States. It's the other Washington state. So we've got this other Washington action mechanism, and what we're in the process of developing is an assessment framework that can actually assess our progress of actions, but more importantly, results. So I'm going to cover energy and environmental equity policies in Washington, and then quite a bit on our input-output model as a framework. We haven't even begun our data collection yet, so we're early in the stages. But this is a great time to come here to the CERG group and get some constructive criticism. And so I'm going to end with some questions, hopefully that will resonate with this audience. So in 2019, Washington made energy justice history. Our legislature enacted and our governor signed, Inslee at the time, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, committing to a greenhouse gas-free electricity supply by 2045. CETA also required Washington communities highly impacted by pollution and climate change to benefit equitably from transitions to a clean energy economy. So Washington has a legal commitment now for a just transition for cleaner energy sources, but also impacts OWAM. And CETA actually required utilities like Puget Sound Energy to, quote, ensure that all customers are benefiting from the transition to clean energy through the equitable distribution of, one, energy and non-energy benefits, and reductions of burdens to vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities. Two, long-term and short-term public health and environmental benefits and reduction of costs and risks. And three, energy security and resiliency. So as you know, good academics, we began our research with a systematic literature review. But to help my students not be tempted by generative AI, we used Western Washington University's Web of Science database, and we searched for sequential appearances of energy justice or energy equity. And the former, energy justice, actually was the first return. It was appearing as sequential words in a letter published by the progressive periodical The Nation all the way back in 2011. But it echoed earlier critiques of mainstream environmentalism history of racist and exclusionary practices. And this author described decarbonization advocacy's justice blind spot. Quote, terms like fuel poverty, and energy justice are seldom seen in US publications, end quote, wrote the commentator. They continued, millions of people need to increase their use of energy in order to live with some measure of dignity. A year later, we found a publication by Brent Sovacool, a co-authored, and along with Andres Goldthaw, they offered this assessment, quote, due to unclear levels of interference and authority and weak resilience, the current energy system is ill-designed to cope with the triple challenges of energy security, energy justice, and low-carbon energy transition. And in this graphic adapted from a National Academy's publication, Accelerating Decarbonization in the United States from 2024, analysts put energy justice in a timeline stretching back to the 1970s. And consistent with our literature review, they placed the energy justice movement's emergence in the 2010s. So energy justice and energy equity seem like relatively new academic and even practitioner concepts. And as you heard from my too long bio, I need to start shortening that in the future. But during most of my academic career, I've focused on environmental justice. And so I really hope that your clean energy research group can help me and my team with some constructive criticism today. So the just transition in the 1970s really kind of bubbled up in a labor movement. But ironically, one of the first unions that started raising concerns about job losses was the Oil and Chemical Worker Union because of all the new environmental policies that were being passed. And then in the 1980s, you see the emergence of the environmental justice movement. And I've been dabbling in that as mostly as an academic and more recently as an advocate in the last 10 years as a technical advisor for an environmental justice group in South Seattle called the Duwamish River Community Coalition.
Can you tell us more about what the focus of the environmental justice movement is?
Yeah, the focus, most of the focus of the environmental justice movement is on distributive justice, which is a term I'll get to. And that's the distribution of environmental goods and bads. And in particular, their spatial distribution. But as that literature evolved and got wider and more interdisciplinary, other justice principles started bubbling up, and I'll talk about four basic ones in a couple of slides. And my very first environmental justice publication was back in 2008 when I looked at the distribution of toxic industrial sources in the St. Louis metropolitan region. And while there were lots of industrial facilities around that metropolitan region, the kind of value added of that publication, I would say, was adding a risk characterization of the pollution that was being emitted by those sources. So a steam plant for a university, an energy plant, doesn't release a lot of toxic emissions, but a copper smelter does. And so does a zinc smelter. And so does a chemical factory. And it just so happens that three of the largest in the entire Midwest were spatially located in East St. Louis, Missouri, which is 99% African American. So it was a clear instance of a distributive injustice that continues to persist to this day and only has gotten better a little bit because some of those facilities have actually closed. Thank you. Can I answer your question?
Yes.
But because energy justice and energy equity are relatively new, And if you know differently, I look forward to hearing your suggestions on tracing this more deeply in the histories of some academics. But uh, the utilities in Washington State have this new law, and of course, a staffer wrote in equitable distribution in a couple of places. And now those utilities, and really Washington uh, residents, even like me, need to figure out what that means. What is an equitable distribution? And so Puget Sound Energy, which is an investor-owned, highly regulated utility because they have a monopoly business for most of the state of Washington, is engaged in developing this just transition, and they ask us for help. And we're now in, I don't know, the fourth month of a contract. I talked about our team, but we have also, I think, a really unique research design that's you may be familiar with, participatory action research. And we're actually working with Puget Sound Energy to engage their staff in various parts of that utility to figure out best ways to achieve an equitable distribution and ultimately energy justice. And we plan, or we're using a policy assessment framework that we've used in past work. And so I want to turn now to that. Have you ever heard the quote about laws and sausages in one of your political science classes? It's one you basically don't want to know how they're made. So goes the saying. And I found this quote in the Yale Book of Quotation: to retain respect of laws and sausages, one must not watch them in the making. This is a standard input-output model that goes all the way back to 1965 and David Easton, who visualized a political system where there are inputs like election results that go in that change things in this black box, where those inputs are translated in outputs like laws, regulations, and decision. And it's a visualization that appears in my undergraduate environmental law and policy text, and I build on for students in that course. However, political scientists regularly criticize this depiction for treating a political system like a black box or a system without internal workings explained. But there's another omission in this variant. It's missing outcomes or impacts. Laws and regulations and decisions are important, but so are the results. And there are lots of laws, regulations, and decisions that never actually achieve what they were designed to achieve. And we think another representation, but also a input-output model can build on this, but also help us understand how these things happen in a multi-level federalism system, much like you have here, but of course with special differences, the federalism that you practice here in Canada. Our team is using Eleanor Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework. And in this visualization, the inputs on the left, 3 exogenous variables, rules and use, attributes of community and biophysical conditions, impact not a black box of politics, but what Ostrom referred to as an action arena filled with action situations and participants. Those patterns of interactions produce outputs, but also there is room here, we think, for assessing outcomes or impacts, something like the performance of greenhouse gas reductions over time. And what this visualization actually depicts is the lowest or operational level action situations where you have this action arena directly affecting socio-environmental conditions. And here they're labeled outcomes instead of outputs or impacts. And we're going to start shortly with the right-hand side on evaluative criteria, but just a bit about a little bit of the theory behind this. This is a kind of new institutionalism. It's actor-centered institutionalism at the heart of the IAD framework, where individual choices are not like Hardin once argued, tragedies occurring in vacuums, but within action arenas. At the center, Ostrom described them as, quote, the social space where participants with diverse preferences interact, exchange goods and services, solve problems, dominate one another, or fight. But Ostrom described different inputs, those exogenous variables that influence common pool resource action arenas, what she won a Nobel Prize in economics for. So individuals, communities, and institutions in those action arenas, organizations like PSE, which is short for Puget Sound Energy, face institutional rules that incentivize or constrain certain actions. There are biophysical and material inputs, but there are also communities inputting into the action arena, perhaps the very communities next to a major power plant in our energy grid. And those combinations and interactions result in different patterns of outcomes, but they can also be impacted by action arenas through feedback loops. And this is a very kind of simple input-output model of a complex political system. We might even borrow from another term that Ostrom used, which is socio-ecological systems. We might just change the E to energy. But we're going to start with some backward mapping and the evaluative criteria on that right-hand side. These are 4 pillars of environmental justice that emerged from our research. Distributional justice aims to ensure that marginalized and vulnerable populations do not receive an inordinate share of the burdens or are denied access to benefits. Number 2, procedural justice requires inclusive decision-making processes that seek to ensure proceedings are fair, equitable, and inclusive for participants, because marginalized and vulnerable populations have been historically excluded from decision-making processes. Recognition justice requires an understanding of historic and ongoing inequalities and prescribes efforts that seek to reconcile these inequalities. And it's interesting to look at the way the literature generates this third kind of justice coming out of the reckoning with the Native American and settler colonialism injustices of the US history. And of course, many of those are at play here in Canada as well. But another pillar comes up in our research, and this is perhaps the newest. It's called restorative justice. And it's defined by regulatory government organizations or other interventions to disrupt and address those 3 prior injustices and to correct them through laws, policies, orders, and practices. But how do we assess the disruption? How do we assess progress towards energy equity? Well, this, we believe, is where my background and my experience in environmental justice science has an application. Because we need a research design for assessing outcomes against those evaluative criteria, and we also need methodologies. And I developed this 4D conceptualization of environmental justice science with some of the key techniques we're going to deploy in collaboration with Puget Sound Energy. And in 2024, in a meeting of environmental justice scientists from across the country for the Environmental Protection Agency Science Advisory Board, I joined that group. And we were asked this question by the Office of Research Development lead, Christopher Frey. That office is now gone, and anything environmental justice is also gone. And sometime in February, I got a terse little email informing me that my appointment on EPA Science Advisory Board would be terminated soon. But the question still remains, what are the minimum technical elements for EJ science assessments in regulatory analysis? And as a science advisor, you're put together in these meetings, but you also have to write responses to questions and submit those to the federal direct officer that informed me I would be terminated. It's kind of scary how they didn't use the word fire or released, but they
Elon Musk
terminated. Well, Elon Musk and I we held the same appointment. We were both special government employees. I do not own a Tesla, however. So I tried to simplify it. Environmental justice science should be 4D. And I used these principles and had been developing them in an inclusive methods for environmental justice collaboratory to map and analyze distributions of stressors, differentiations of social groups. Oh, I skipped distributions, differentiations, and disparities of both, actually disproportionalities, and disparities. My text needs to be updated. So by the way, that acronym is I'm for EJ. How about you?
Can you define each of those terms?
That would be inclusive methods for environmental justice, and define each of those terms now. So let's start with distributions. So first, analysts assess stressor dispersions or distributions. I'm mixing up a lot of these. I apologize, but it still works with geographic mapping and analysis. These are two maps I produced to support that environmental justice organization in South Seattle. On the left is a map of Seattle with the location of 32 major air sources and other industries with combustion processes. The size of the circle and the shading is a classification of the relative volume of air pollution released into the environment from those companies. And that's the map on the left. And so you might think in the terms of cleaner, i.e. they're polluting less on the left, but safer on the right, because not all pollution is created equally. Some pollution is riskier and worse for us than other pollution. So greenhouse gas emissions might kind of still be considered a pollutant in the United States. It certainly is in Washington State. But in terms of human health, it's a lot less risky for us in the immediate acute term than something like lead, arsenic, cobalt, nickel, etc. The bigger and darker the circle, the dirtier the source. So you can see just on the southern edge, right smack in the Duwamish River Valley, where that community organization and I are working to improve the pollution disparities, you see a large circle.
So can I ask you, RSEI, that's index of hazard?
Yeah, so that's the risk screening environmental indicators, which In this case is being used to visualize the relative risk of emissions at specific source locations.
And that's your index, or is it?
No, it actually is an EPA index.
Okay.
And my last check is that tool is still available at the EPA website. You might be able to find a mapping tool called EZRESI, EZRSEI. So on the right, those same facilities, their emissions are now characterized by the relative risk of those emissions to nearby neighbors. And so it simulates a plume of different emissions, and it calculates a surrogate inhalation dose for nearby populations, also estimated from census data, and calculates not a cancer risk or a real risk, but a relative risk. They're unitless values, but it is a screening device. And so you can see those same facilities look very different on the right-hand side. And many of them are metal processing facilities. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So that's the first D, distributions of environmental polluters and their risk. The second D, distributions, is where researchers measure, demographics. I've got too many D's in my head. Demographics of social groups across relevant geographies. And a quick definition of demography: it's the number and characteristics of the people who live in an area in relation to their race, income, education. And this is PSE's named communities, a term for highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations. And that's a community designated by the Washington State Department of Health based on a cumulative impact analysis, or a community located in census tracts that are fully or partially on tribal land. So if it's tribal land, it's automatically designated. A named communities is the word PSE uses. Our state health department uses vulnerable communities. Vulnerable populations mean those communities experience a disproportionate cumulative risk from environmental burdens due to adverse socioeconomic factors such as unemployment, access to food and healthcare, and sensitivity factors such as low birth weight and higher rates of hospitalization. The third D, disproportionalities, really gets that cumulative impact analysis is a form of that. And sociologist William Freudenberg posed a disproportionality hypothesis and asserted that relatively few heavy polluters produce environmental degradation and overuse of natural resources. He found major polluters tend to be inefficient producers of low-value commodities, and rather than being major employers, they can have emissions to jobs ratios 1,000 times worse than the economy as a whole. And these pollution outliers tend to be small in number, with emissions far above average for facilities in their sector, even after controlling for plant size, employees, and output. And Freudenberg called this sociological hypothesis and phenomenon privileged access. So these industries have privileged access to both environmental rights to emit pollutions and to extract the resources to generate commodities while still releasing. But the largest purple dot in the entire state of Washington resides in South Seattle's Duwamish River Valley. So that's a picture of the industrial risk disproportionality across the state of Washington. And the fourth D is disadvantage. And many of the new mapping tools like this one, our Washington Health Disparities Map, exemplifies this approach, where analysts characterize disadvantaged, move that, just a little disadvantaged locations falling into the highest percentiles of relevant distributions. So if you look on the left-hand side, it says environmental health disparities version 2.0. That is an index of multiple indicators of environmental exposure, environmental effects, socioeconomic factors, and sensitive populations. And if you're on the website, you can click one of those and it'll dig you down deeper into specific indicators. And there are probably over 30 different indicators that inform this map. So you can see those disadvantaged locations across the state. So that's our 4Ds. And we're bringing this to the assessment for energy equity. But we're also joining those who have criticized Ostrom for ignoring power. Actually, there was a special issue in a symposium of the Perspective on Politics that invited several political scientists to critique Ostrom's research program in the wake of her Nobel Prize win. But later, a critical geographer, Florine Clement, offered maybe one of the most direct ways to critique and then enrich the IAD by politicizing it. They added two new categories of exogenous factors for an action situation. Use the laser pointer here. So now we have political economic context and discourses, in addition to the three original. And what this does is modify the IAD following Clement with two additional variables. But based on my review I've already talked about in those criteria, you could also add all four pillars of environmental justice as an evaluative criterion on the right-hand side, which then not only politicizes the IAD, but justifies it. So it's politicized and justified. And this just gives me an excuse to wear my Stetson hat that looks a lot like the main character in the Fox FX series Justified, U.S. Marshal Raylan Givens. So first, just really briefly, settler colonialism in Washington is not a relic of the past, but it's an ongoing political economic system shaping energy injustice and inequity. Defined by the permanent occupation and transformation of indigenous lands, settler colonialism operates through a logic of elimination that seeks to erase indigenous presence physically, legally, and culturally, while legitimizing settler claims through narratives of progress and development. Many have written and informed my descriptions of settler colonialism. I have a couple of sources here. But this dynamic is evident in the historical dispossession of Coast Salish tribes and the imposition of governance systems that prioritize economic growth, its cheap energy demands, and urban expansion over ecological restoration and treaty compliance. Second, according to environmental discourse theory, and in particular John Dryzik's work, conflict arises from the communicative dissonance among stakeholders, assumptions, judgments, and contentions over the causes and remedies for environmental problems. Hager also defined discourses as a specific ensemble of ideas, concepts, and categorizations through which meaning is given to physical and social realities. Now, Dryzik went on to identify four kinds of discourses that actually define what the politics of the earth are. There's a problem-solving discourse with reformist and prosaic perspectives. It's a typology that I should have displayed here. There's a survivalism discourse, and we can think about Malthus and much of the 1970s, including the Tom Ehrlich's, it was Ehrlich's population, Paul Ehrlich's population bomb. There's a sustainability discourse But there's also a green radicalism discourse, and that's an imaginative and radical perspective that we would locate energy justice and energy equity. We would propose that both are a form of green radicalism. So let me just put a contrast between some of those. This is from Dorsey Taylor's The Rise of the Environmental Justice Paradigm, the Injustice Framing and the Social Construction of Environmental Discourses. There is a dominant social paradigm in American history. Humans have a right to modify natural environments suiting their needs. Humans created to rule nature, plants, animals exist for human use. Then there's a romantic environmental paradigm. Human nature interference is often disastrous. And these are actually questions we can ask in public opinion surveys and distinguish the discursive perspective of respondents. So they would strongly agree with any of these statements, depending on which discourse they're located in. We're approaching Earth's population limit. Nature's balance is delicate and fragile. But green radicalism, environmental justice, is a right to clean air, land, water, food. It emphasizes the elimination of racism, sexism, classism, but it also calls for respect for other natural belief systems and spirituality, i.e., the epistemologies of Native Americans that do not separate humans from nature. So every wild salmon that we help extinguish in our dam and energy systems and our development in Washington is yet another cultural injustice inflicted on the Native American tribes. So that leads me to the penultimate slide, which is how does this mechanism work? And it works through equity, the equitable distribution. And Puget Sound Energy has, because of these new laws, has pledged to direct 30% of their clean energy investments into the most vulnerable communities in their service area. Now, equity is an unsettled term. Some argue it's a process and equality is an outcome. In other words, you might say that equity is essential to achieve true equality. And the Race Matter Institute once said the route to achieving equity will not be accomplished through treating everyone equally. It will be achieved by treating everyone equitably or justly according to their circumstances. So California developed one of the most substantive EJ policies, I think back in 2001, where they passed a law that 50% of funding for 3 diesel mitigation programs would be spent in the communities with the highest exposures to ambient or localized air contaminants, or in minority or low-income communities, or both. And much of those investments happened in the Long Beach port and the surrounding communities. And California policymakers were some of the first recognizing how EJ would not be accomplished by treating every community equally. Likewise, energy justice or energy equity for Washington consumers and communities will require processes of unequal treatment. And that brings me to my conclusion. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hira, for inviting me today and for your attention. And I have kind of 3 questions to maybe spark some ideas, but certainly it is a ask for help. Does our institutional analysis framework resonate? Could this kind of analysis work in Canada? And finally, could this OWAM work for other nations? In other words, the other Washington action mechanism that also includes a way to assess results. Thank you.
We'll share just in case there are people online that will ask questions.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the gallery view.
Okay, the floor is open for any of you that want to make comments or have any questions. Alex is working on gender equity in the energy industry, so on a parallel topic. What are your thoughts about this, Alex?
It's very, very interesting. Lots to think about there. I'm sure I don't know if I'm best to kind of answer your question there, but just overall thinking of the topic is very, very interesting.
Yeah, so if I think about energy equity, or sorry, gender equity, energy equity is on my mind, but gender equity, um, when it comes to this kind of framework, I think there is room within this politicized and justified framework to begin to incorporate that. And this kind of framework is really just a map of independent and dependent variables that you can, um, you know, operationalize for different kinds of equity. Um, and I haven't given much thought to that, but I hope you might be, stimulated in some ideas on how you might define gender equity within an energy justice journey. And so I think this is the kind of framework that might help you think through that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of use to having those kind of like frameworks, that can be applied. I think one of your questions was about this work in Canada, and I think, the beauty of this is that sure adjustments would need to be made, but I think, there is that possibility. So it's nice to be able to build something out that then can be used to such a wide application.
Yeah, and it has room for synthesizing multiple theories, right? So you can incorporate feminist theory and converge it with environmental justice theories to start building a way to actually assess this. But what we're really keen on here is that it leads us to results, but those also have to be operationalized. So what kind of studies are literally operationalizing gender equity or gender inequity? And then do we have the tools and the data to do that in Canadian context or in the US context?
Can you just scroll through and see if there's anyone on the call that has any
I'm looking for
chat? Yeah.
raised hands or anything.
If you hit that arrow on the right, you can also scroll through and
Oh, okay.
yeah, just hit that and see if anyone.
And I do see Matthew DeRosa, one of our team members who's joined us today from Western Washington University.
Okay, so if anyone online has any questions, please raise your hand so we can take note of it. Go ahead, Omri.
Well, thanks for the presentation. It's a really clear breakdown of environmental and energy justice. And I think, yeah, when I think personally and anecdotally about gender justice or about gender representation, my limited experience in the energy sort of justice world and sustainability around energy infrastructure is that it's male dominated.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think if we were to take the framework of development and all of the work that's been done in that field, like international development, and see how economically it's much more advantageous to give those benefits to women and communities, we would see that a lot of the sort of highbrow information gathering that's happening can be kind of circumvented, or maybe not circumvented, but can be also reached through the idea of pinpointing the specific people within communities that would benefit. And I guess to that point, I wanted to ask you about the Justice 40 initiatives that the US federal government adopted under Biden with the help of Elizabeth Warren's team, and how that framework was actually in place as legislated law, took away for 40% of all of the investment made in terms of environment or in adapting and mitigating climate change went to the most historically disadvantaged communities, and why that didn't work or why that didn't resonate, why we aren't talking about it.
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act was the legislative manifestation, and it's within that legislative framework that I think there were commitments to Justice 40, i.e. 40% of the investments of the federal government in the clean energy transition would benefit what they would define as disadvantaged communities. And their team also developed a map. It was called the Climate Justice and Economic Screening Tool. It has been canceled, but it was resurrected. You can find it online. But really interesting aspect of that is that they knew the Supreme Court, especially after our Supreme Court ruled that universities cannot take race into account whatsoever in admissions decisions. They saw writing on the wall that they would be vulnerable if this tool, if this map included any measure of race. So when you look at the CJ EST tool as it's been saved, there is no metric of race, but in Washington state, there is. And I don't know if I can answer the other part of that question with the framework that we've been operating in, or even with the environmental justice. But something happened in American politics, and I would argue that they weren't seeing the economy turn around like they hoped to. And there is an even indication of an American political backlash to Kamala Harris's campaign. And I'm sure you folks have talked a lot about that in political science. But, DEI became diversity, equity, inclusion, became became weaponized to generate rage among many voters across the United States. And early in the election results, every county district in the United States went more for Trump in 2020 than in 2016, except Washington State. Washington State was one of the few places where you saw more votes for Kamala Harris. Am I getting my numbers right? No, 2024, the election of 2024, and then Biden in 2020. I think I had those dates wrong, right? So the Everett Herald actually contacted me why, and we also had a referendum on our Climate Commitment Act, which is another one of our more environmental justice laws. There's also a Healthy Environments for All Act. So we have this triangulation of energy and equity justice in our state that's statutory law. And what the Everett Herald wanted to know is, why is Washington going in the opposite direction of the rest of the country? So I asked my students, and they came up with some interesting hypotheses. We get a lot of California immigrants from high tax burden into our state, and they're more progressive, and they tend to live in Western Washington. We also have higher education levels than a lot of other states in the United States. But then one of the students over, I have an espresso machine in my office, and they said, well, it probably was that Bill Nye campaign ad. And Bill Nye is the science guy that they grew up watching. And he campaigned against the initiative to overturn the Climate Commitment Act. And it was this incredibly short, to the point, great example of political communication that defeated lots of ads for Climate Commitment Act and the claim that it actually had raised our gas prices. So the headline I think the Everett Herald ran was common sense and the science guy saved the Climate Commitment Act. So that's my attempt to answer the second part of your question. So to go more broadly, why did Justice 40 fizzle? It was part of a larger political process. And I just think, broadly speaking, we're now seeing Trump's numbers degrade, and Republicans are starting to stand up to him. And it's my hope that the Trump fever is breaking in our country. But I still am going to apply for asylum while I'm here.
Thank you for the presentation. Just kind of maybe connecting this conversation back to what I was thinking. Wouldn't you, and obviously, public relations campaign, like, and the Bill Nye ad obviously have a lot to do with that, no doubt. But wouldn't there also be economic factors, just trying to look at it through a more political economy lens of, well, there's a lot of growth, economic growth in Washington State through clean energy projects and initiatives. Just searching up real quick on Google, I see a lot of economic output because of bills like this. So wouldn't that also be maybe, I guess what I'm trying to say, now that we're seeing this kind of pushback against DEI and social justice generally in the US, wouldn't more connecting clean energy and a sustainable economy to a productive economy be a better way to go about it than maybe the social justice ethical? I am not that I'm not for it, obviously. It's just that I feel like for the general population of the US, with the education trend going on in the country and everything else, the economic degradation, wouldn't that be a more, I guess, more appealing way of trying to sell that is in the policy realm?
Yeah, it has in the past. So for instance, in Texas, Texas has the most developed wind energy, I think, in the United States.
20%.
20%. And that they passed a renewable portfolio standard. That renewable portfolio standard was signed by one Governor George W. Bush. But once you get to national politics and you select Dick Cheney as your vice president, who's a fossil fuel, I've started using a term with my students called plutocracy. So instead of plutocratic populism, I think we had this moment of plutocratic populism that Trump and his political campaigners were able to communicate and weaponize and build on the outrage industrial complex that is social media. And that just simply overwhelmed the kind of political communication that you're talking about. It was a political communication that worked in moderate Republican camps before. I have another honors student, by the way, looking at the rise of social media and how it's actually made polarization worse. There's political scientists who argue that the polarization is among our leaders, not among our electorate. I don't know if that actually is true. And so I don't know if I helped or if I began to answer your question, but that particular discourse of sustainability and clean energy wasn't working in the rest of the country. And that could be changing.
Was it being pushed?
Oh, it was. It just couldn't compete.
So we just released what we called a scorecard for fossil fuels. So we juxtaposed the estimates of the cost of climate change over time with the jobs, benefits, and revenues from fossil fuels. And I know it's a no-brainer to you, but I think most people don't think about it that way because there are two different conversations. One is about climate change and how it's going to cost us so much to pay for all these new technologies, and one is about all these revenues because of the U.S. tariff war that we have to make up for. Completely false dichotomy.
Yeah. I had another undergraduate do a project for I have an environmental research and communication class, and they're from Texas. And they're from a part of Houston and Harris County that has a lot of industrial polluters. And he was just flabbergasted at essentially the cognitive dissonance. And I think there was a moment when Trump was welcomed by that community facing this burden of pollution. And Trump talked about how they were going to decrease the regulatory burden on those industries even more. So there is this cognitive dissonance at play, something else one of my students is operating with. But I know enough psychology to just be dangerous enough, I suppose. But we have been, I think something really, there was a kind of cultural illness that have afflicted our political, and I don't think it's going to go away until the economic conditions broadly improve. But I also kind of blame myself and other academics for frankly being too academic and not trying to come up with better communication strategies. We need to find folks like Bill Nye that still have a little bit of resonance with a wider population than someone like Al Gore, and frankly, someone like me, because I'm a professor, right? And now universities are a target of that outrage industrial complex.
I hope you don't, this may be a bit wayward, but you mentioned that Al Gore isn't really critified him.
Is it really what?
He's not really critified by the public or whatever.
He's not what?
Oh, I'm trying to coin the word critified or
Critified.
He isn't credible by the public, you feel, Al Gore.
Well, I think many of the framing studies where Al Gore was presented as the face of climate change, it actually had a whiplash effect, especially on Republican voters. Something else my student so the messenger is important, and Al Gore's message stopped resonating with Republican voters quite a while ago. Actually, right around when social media, around 2007, when we had a year of the first smartphone. And you see there's a question that Gallup asks. Should we prioritize the environment over economic growth, or should we prioritize economic growth over the environment? In 1990, the difference between Republicans and conservatives was 2 points, 61 and 59. In 2023, that difference was almost 60 points. Only 20% of Republicans were saying that we should prioritize the environment. So what the Republican election consultants successfully did was establish the environment and climate change as a culture war issue. And so Al Gore became the face of that. So if you want to have a serious conversation with a Republican about climate change, don't talk about climate change. Talk about health benefits or lower costs, and don't mention Al Gore.